This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 431 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. It's just me today saying it, but thanks for tuning in. The 2020 NFL season is in full swing, and there's no easier way to get in on the action than with FanDuel's Gridiron Pick'em contest. All you have to do is pick the winner of each week's matchups correctly, and you'll take home a share of the $5,000 weekly jackpot. The best part? It's completely free to play. To enter for free, visit playfree.fanduel.com/gridiron. Eligibility restrictions apply. Now let's dig into this week's transactions. Buy Deontay Johnson. So sometimes with these transactions, I just have to feel things out. I have to look at what people are saying on social media, on Twitter in particular, and I kind of have to just go from there. People seem to be very down on Deontay Johnson. I mean, last week in my mentions, people were asking me if they should just drop Deontay Johnson because of Chase Claypool emerging in this offense. And the answer to that is no, absolutely not. Do not drop Deontay Johnson. And because of this thinking, because people are thinking this way, this is probably a time to buy Deontay Johnson. I'm not one to usually trade for an injured player. And Johnson missed this past week with a back injury. But according to Pro Football Doc, it's not a major injury. There was a chance that he was going to play in week 6. So he should be back on the field soon. And when he's been on the field, he has produced. In week 1, he had a 32.3% target share. Week 2, 31.7%. It's just that things have happened over the last 3 games that Pittsburgh's played. Johnson had a concussion, and then he got this back injury where he missed a huge chunk of that game, and then he missed all of last week's game. His lack of production over his last 2 games that he's played has nothing to do with skill. It has to do with an injury, or multiple injuries. And I'm just going to repeat what I said last week on this show. Chase Claypool's emergence hurts James Washington when everyone's healthy more than Deontay Johnson. Obviously, Johnson was out this past week, so James Washington was able to ball out. But in weeks 1 and 2, the 2 games where Deontay Johnson's been healthy, the snap split between Johnson and Washington was 109-68, and that was in Deontay Johnson's favor. So what I'm saying here is Chase Claypool can continue to do what he's been doing with Deontay Johnson back and healthy. They both can get theirs. Because let's be honest, Juju Smith-Schuster is not getting his. He has a really low average at the target. His target share isn't very strong. He's not someone that you can reliably start in fantasy football right now. And because of that, it's going to be very easy for some of these guys like Deontay Johnson to be able to see a decent enough target share to be reliable week in and week out. So me saying buy Deontay Johnson, it doesn't mean to sell Chase Claypool. You should be buying both of those players because they're both awesome. But right now, people don't think that Deontay Johnson is awesome. Add Boston Scott. So Miles Sanders left Sunday's game with a knee injury. And then on Monday, Adam Schefter tweeted that Sanders is likely going to be sidelined for 1 to 2 weeks. He's at least going to miss Thursday's game. So that leaves us with Boston Scott. He and Corey Clement shared the backfield back in week 1 when Miles Sanders missed that game. The Eagles were really bad offensively. But let's look at the peripherals. Boston Scott saw a snap share of about 56% to Clement's 37%. He handled 9 carries to Clement's 6, and then both of them had 2 targets. So I would expect Scott to be the 1A in this backfield. And they've got a relatively decent matchup against the Giants on Thursday. Sell or hold DeAndre Swift. So this is one of those transactions where context really, really matters. The headline readers of the 15 transactions column aren't going to like this transaction, or at least they're not going to know how to utilize it. But on Sunday, DeAndre Swift ran the ball 14 times for 116 yards and 2 touchdowns. He had a huge game. And most importantly about that stat line, he had 3 goal line touches. He only had 1 across the first 5 weeks of the season. That's the good news. The bad news is that he still played just 37.7% of Detroit's offensive snaps. And even though he did see an increase in running back rush share, he only saw about 42% of the Lions' running back rushes. So his peripheral numbers were not very strong. He's trending up, but those numbers didn't really match that week 6 stat line. So here's what you do, or here's what I would do. If you have DeAndre Swift and your team has 1, 2, or maybe 3 wins this year, you might want to go out and try to sell high on this performance because you need to win right now. But if you can afford to wait this thing out, and winning teams probably can, that's not a bad idea. Because Swift is a talented running back who's already shown that he can catch the ball out of the backfield. He has a target share that's above 12% this year. And if that running back rush share continues to trend up, then we're looking at a potential strong running back during the second half of the season. So if you're a bad team with Swift, sell him. If you're a good team with Swift, I would hold him. Add LaMichael Pirine. So there hasn't been a 15 transactions show since Le'Veon Bell signed with the Chiefs. But with Bell no longer on the Jets, that backfield is now Frank Gore, who's 45 years old, Ty Johnson, who's actually, I think, kind of underrated, and then rookie LaMichael Pirine. Pirine saw a decent amount of work on Sunday. He ran the ball 7 times, he had a few targets, and in terms of market share, he finished the game with 33.3% of the team's running back rushes and a 7.7% target share. Those types of numbers aren't going to do much for you week over week. But you're not adding Pirine this week because you want immediate production. You're hoping that his role grows because it's not like he's competing with really, really good running backs. Nothing against Frank Gore. And get this, despite those market share numbers that were pretty mediocre, Pirine played 16 more snaps than Frank Gore. Gore just outrushed him 11-7. So I think that he's worth a stash. And the Jets should get Sam Darnold back soon. And hopefully, fingers crossed, the Jets don't have Adam Gase soon because he ruins fantasy football. Buy Jerry Jeudy. So look, guys, Jerry Jeudy's rookie season has not been great in terms of production. Through 5 games, he's finished as the wide receiver 44 or worse in weekly scoring 4 different times. And if not for a really great touchdown, a long touchdown against the Jets, he'd be 5 for 5. But his peripheral numbers really aren't that bad. He ranks in the top 20 in air yards per game of all skill position players, and he's seen a target share of at least 18% in all but one of his games played this year. On the season, he has a 20.6% target share. That's a number that's been matched by just 25 different wideouts. And I should mention that Denver hasn't played with Drew Lock every single game this year. They haven't had their quarterback, and they faced a relatively tough schedule for wide receivers. I just think that right now is a really decent time to buy very low on Jerry Jeudy because it shouldn't take a whole lot to acquire him. Sell Ryan Tannehill. So if you listen to the late round podcast over the offseason, you know that I liked Tannehill as a later round quarterback this year. It was kind of a weird situation where last year when he took over as starter for Tennessee, he was a top 3 quarterback in fantasy football from when he took over through the end of the season. Traditionally, we would have expected a player like that to be like a top 7 or 8 quarterback the following year. But everyone's gotten smarter in the fantasy football world. People recognize regression. And as a result, he was being drafted as like a mid or lower end QB2. It seemed like the market was overstating the regression. Now, I'm saying all of this because I just want to make note that I like Ryan Tannehill. I think Tannehill is really good. But I also think that you should try to sell him right now. Trading away a quarterback in a single quarterback format is almost always a good idea in fantasy football. But I think there are additional reasons to get rid of Tannehill right now. One of those reasons is his touchdown rate. Last season, when he was incredibly efficient, his touchdown rate was 7.7%. That's very high. That's a very good touchdown rate. And given historical evidence, we would expect that type of number to regress, maybe closer to 6% the following year. So far in 2020, it's 7.5%. It's almost identical to last year. Meanwhile, when you look at his passing yards to touchdowns ratio, that looks a little bit messed up too. From 2011 to 2019, quarterbacks threw a touchdown on every 162.6 yards. Now in 2020, that number's closer to 150 yards because offenses are scoring a lot of points right now. But even still, no matter how you look at it, if you want to look at it from 2011 to 2019 or just 2020, Tannehill is overperforming in the touchdown column. He's thrown a touchdown in every 105 passing yards this year. Now look, Ryan Tannehill is a better than average quarterback. He's probably a top 10 quarterback. And good quarterbacks tend to have better marks in all these statistics. In passing yards to touchdowns, in touchdown rate, good quarterbacks are going to be better than average, even though these numbers do regress. It's just that Ryan Tannehill's numbers are so good right now. It's very, very difficult to maintain this type of pace. And considering that they just lost Taylor Lewan to an ACL injury, and moving forward, they get Pittsburgh, Chicago, Indianapolis, and Baltimore in 4 of their next 5 games, I think there's a lot of reasons to sell Tannehill right now. Drop Marvin Jones. Sometimes you guys just need someone to say, drop this guy. I can be that guy for you. But I want to be clear, with Marvin Jones, I would only be dropping him in shallower leagues. Because we know that Jones has a high ceiling, at least a high weekly ceiling. We've seen that in the past. The threat is always there. And his week 6 target share wasn't that horrendous at 16%. But since Kenny Galladay's come back from his injury, Jones is averaging a 10.9% target share per game. On the season, he's yet to finish higher than wide receiver 38 in weekly scoring. It has not been a good year for Marvin Jones. So if you're in a shallower league, you can drop him. Add or buy Dallas Goedert. So hopefully you listened to Friday's mailbag episode because I actually talked about adding Dallas Goedert on that show. I know it was later than the transactions episode, but I wanted to bring up these guys that are coming off IR and how they sort of slip through the cracks. With Dallas Goedert, he's still available in 60% of Yahoo leagues. And he could come back as soon as this week. I don't know if we see it happen, but it's possible. And not only was he outproducing Zach Ertz before his week 3 injury, but now Ertz is sidelined. Now Ertz has an injury. He's out for 3 to 4 weeks. So if Goddard does return soon, he's going to be probably the top target in this Philadelphia offense, or at least one of them. And after having about a 20% target share across the first 2 weeks of the season, Goddard needs to be rostered everywhere. The tight end position is not good enough for Dallas Goedert to be a free agent. Add Travis Fulgham. So speaking of the Eagles, Travis Fulgham is still out there in 70% of Yahoo leagues. Of course, I mentioned him last week after his blow-up game against Pittsburgh, but then he had another good game against Baltimore this week. He's now seen 36.1% and 26.3% of the team's targets over the last 2 weeks. He's been targeted 15 or more yards down the field 6 times. That's one of the higher marks in the NFL over the last 2 weeks. Even when the other Philadelphia pass catchers come back, I think Fulgham is going to have a role. So keep him on your team and add him if he's a free agent. Buy Myles Gaskin. So last week, not on the 15 transactions episode, but on another episode, I talked about wanting to buy Myles Gaskin or wanting this to be a transaction in the 15 transactions episode. I wish I would have last week, but fortunately he didn't find the end zone this week. I'm just not sure the fantasy football world realizes how good Myles Gaskin has been. He's now seen almost 62% of Miami's running back rushes this year and almost a 15% target share. And those numbers only are getting better and better. Jordan Howard's been a healthy scratch in each of the last 2 games for the Dolphins. And in those games, Gaskin has averaged a 70% running back rush share and almost a 16% target share per game. Guys, I can't stress this enough. Those are elite numbers. And more importantly, he's taken on the role as the goal line back. He's seen all 3 running back touches at the goal line over the last 2 weeks without Jordan Howard. And within the 10-yard line, he's seen 6 of the 7 running back touches. It doesn't look like Myles Gaskin is just going away. And I think that this is one of those instances where it just takes time for these players who emerge from nowhere. It takes time for fantasy managers to realize that they're legit. We might still be in that window where people don't fully realize it with Myles Gaskin. Add Sterling Shepard. So another player who could return from injury this week is Sterling Shepard. He's been out with a toe injury since week 2. Now back in September, he didn't do a whole lot against Pittsburgh and Chicago. But in 2019, don't forget, he averaged a target share per game of about 24%. It was actually over 24%. The Giants have a fairly soft schedule moving forward. I think Sterling Shepard, who's still available in like 70% of leagues, I think that he's a good add. Buy Tyler Boyd. The Cincinnati Bengals are one of the most pass-heavy teams in the NFL. And we should have seen this coming. Over the offseason, I talked about how if you look at neutral script pass rates, not overall pass rates, but neutral script pass rates, those numbers are more predictive for next season's overall ratio than the overall pass rates translating year over year. And last season, Cincinnati was not good. We know that. But even in neutral game scripts, they were pass heavy. We would expect them to be pass heavy overall because they were often in negative game scripts. But even when games were close for Cincinnati, they were throwing the ball a lot. That's what this offense wants to do. And that helps all of the pass catchers in this offense. including Tyler Boyd. He hasn't finished higher than wide receiver 20 in weekly wide receiver rankings since week 3. But I wouldn't be that concerned. He's hit at least a 20% target share in each of his last 4 contests. And honestly, guys, go look at the Cincinnati Bengals' upcoming schedule. The only tough matchups they have moving forward is against Pittsburgh. And as we know, the Steelers aren't as tough against slot receivers. So I like Tyler Boyd. Hold Mike Gesicki. So it was rough for Mike Gesicki in week 6. He scored 0 fantasy points. And a lot of you are probably thinking, I want to drop Mike Gesicki right now. I want to tilt drop him. Don't do that though. According to Pro Football Focus, he still ran 24 routes on Sunday. That was significantly higher than any other tight end on the team. He actually ran more routes than Preston Williams. It only resulted in about a 7% target share, but Gesicki still ranks in the top 15 in tight end target share this year. Tight ends don't grow on trees. It's hard to find any usage at the tight end position, so just hold tight. Add Teddy Bridgewater. The Panthers' offense wasn't that great against Chicago this past week in a tough matchup, but things do look a little bit better in week 7. They get the Saints in a game according to FanDuel Sportsbook that has a 51-point over-under. And the Saints rank as the second best matchup for fantasy quarterbacks in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed this season. Not only that, guys, but Bridgewater continues to be a pretty huge regression candidate. He's thrown for 1,677 yards, but he only has 6 passing touchdowns. On that total, he should be closer to 10 or 11. That's the biggest discrepancy on the negative side in all of football. So don't expect him to maintain this current rate of throwing touchdowns all season long. Add the Philadelphia Eagles defense. The Eagles defense is rostered in just 31% of Yahoo leagues, so they're a streamer for a lot of you listening to this. They're a very viable defensive streamer. They're facing the Giants on Thursday night. That game has a 44.5-point over-under, and the Eagles right now are 4-point favorites. They've got a shot to see a positive game script defensively. And that would be nice against Daniel Jones. In their 5 losses this year, every defense that they faced has ranked in the top 8 in fantasy points scored that week. The 16th transaction that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com this week, it's a twofer, or maybe a threefer. But it's to add Tevin Coleman, I guess JaMychal Hasty, and then Gus Edwards. This is strictly based off of injuries that sort of happened on Sunday. Mark Ingram hurt his ankle, Gus Edwards stepped in, and he saw half of Baltimore's running back rushes. Mark Ingram's hit a 50% running back rush share in just 2 of his games played this year, because that Baltimore backfield's annoying. The Ravens do have a bye this week, but keep an eye on the Ingram situation. And then with Tevin Coleman, he was supposed to return from his injury around this time. Raheem Mostert's apparently going on IR with a high ankle sprain, so Coleman could be a sneaky add this week, given his injury timeline showed that he'd be back around right now. But also watch for news on JaMychal Hasty. He ended up carrying the ball 9 times when Mostert got hurt on Sunday night. I do think Jerick McKinnon's the big winner here, like we saw before when Mostert was sidelined, but you should still be throwing some darts at the other guys in this backfield. Basically, this 16th transaction is to remind you guys that there were a couple of running back injuries that we have to monitor this week. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, do me a big favor and leave a rating and review. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you. I'll be back tomorrow with the Weekly 10 Trend Show.